So first off, Bitcoin hit a record high of more than 61,000 last month, three times what it was 3 months earlier, and it's still hovering around that high mark. What would you say is Bitcoin's role in a balanced portfolio? Is it a hedge to the equities market? What is your take on that?
I think there's a couple ways to look at Bitcoin in particular. It could be a hedge for a number of folks. I think a lot of institutional investors and some retail investors look at it as a form of digital gold, and could replace gold in a traditional portfolio. I think for a lot of other investors and retail in particular, it is somewhat a venture play. There's obviously been massive price appreciation over the course of its history, and it continues to happen. So I think if you look at it from that venture play, where there is risk, obviously, in investing in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general, but the balanced portfolio, maybe 1-2% of somebody's traditional portfolio, could provide an outsized return, uncorrelated return as well.
As I alluded to just in the opening, during the coronavirus, we've seen this rapid rise in Bitcoin prices. Is this a different kind of investor entering the market now than it was before during the crypto rush of 2017, 2018?
Yeah, the really fascinating thing about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin in particular as an asset class is that it really started as a retail asset class. Long before Wall Street and institutional investors found crypto, you had retail investors, engineers, people on the cutting edge of technology starting to invest in it and trade with it and figure out what it could actually do. And I think that's really what 2017 was driven by, more retail than institutional money. The infrastructure just wasn't there at that time to support larger dollar amounts, larger trades. And that has really changed over the past couple of years, where you're seeing a lot more on-ramps, and the infrastructure being really built out to support that. Bitstamp reinvested over the last couple of years in rebuilding our exchange infrastructure with NASDAQ as a partner to be able to support these increased trading volumes and to support the asset class like any other institutional asset class. And so I think of this cycle, while it's still being driven a lot by retail, you have seen many more institutions, traditional hedge funds, pension funds, even endowments, getting involved in cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin in particular. And I think that is driving this wave of institutional adoption, and also corporate treasuries, as experienced by Tesla in particular.
Mm. But it does also seem like it's going a little bit more mainstream, right? I mean, there are a handful of companies with applications before the SEC for authorization of Bitcoin ETFs. I think one recently filed by Fidelity. And then our northern neighbor, Canada, has already authorized Bitcoin ETFs, I think, since earlier this year. Are these developments or signs of Bitcoin becoming more mainstream? And what do you think this signals for the future of cryptocurrency in general?
I definitely think it's a sign of crypto becoming more mainstream, being more accepted by regulators in general, and getting some clarity. A lot of us in the space who have been operating, like Bitstamp since 2011, have been looking for more regulatory clarity. We've embraced regulation from day one as an exchange, and we would welcome more of that. And I think an ETF approval would be a great sign of regulators coming to terms with what crypto is, how it could benefit institutional and retail investors, and giving greater access, more on-ramps to it. I also think this is a first step. I always think of Bitcoin as kind of the gateway into crypto. What we're seeing in decentralized finance, DeFi, NFTs, non-fungible tokens, and a lot of that long tail ecosystem in crypto is really at the cutting edge. And I really do think could reshape the financial markets. And we are just so early still. But I think some of the things like an ETF will get a lot more folks and institutions into the space to start exploring some of those more long tail, interesting, more decentralized finance platforms.
We talked about the rise of Bitcoin to that high of 61,000, but it hasn't been necessarily a steady ascent. There's quite a bit of volatility that before we got to that 61,000. Do you think that there's still a lot of volatility left in Bitcoin? And if so, how does an investor stomach that from day to day?
Yeah, I think again, comparing Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies to kind of venture investments or early stage technology investments, I do think there'll be more volatility. I don't think it'll be shocking to potentially see another 50% drawdown, but I always compare it to a stock like Amazon, that has had a number of 80 to 90% drawdowns over the course of its history as a public company, and it's still one of the best performing public equities of all time. So I think crypto could be similar to that. I think a lot of the long tail assets could be similar to that, where there could be larger drawdowns. And I think the way to remove some of that volatility is think of it as a buy and hold investment. Try not to day trade it necessarily unless you really have strong conviction about something. Or if you do invest in some of those long tail assets, they outperform Bitcoin kind of as a benchmark, maybe reevaluate your portfolio and rebalance it in some ways. But I do think buy and hold is a good way to kind of ignore some of that volatility as much as possible. But I do think you're going to continue to see it as this asset class continues to grow.
That's probably really good advice all around. Switching gears just slightly, I read recently that Bitstamp is considering support for as many as 25 new listings. So it brought to mind a question of whether or not you think cryptocurrencies are created equal.
I don't think they're all created equal. I think Bitcoin, in a lot of ways, is the brand, for crypto, and has been the gateway for a lot of users, and is still one of the, longest cryptocurrencies in existence and a store of value. So do I think there's going to be one winner take all? I don't. I think Bitcoin will be a store of value and is for a long time probably going to be at the forefront of things. But I do think that long tail is going to be really, really interesting. And again, I view it like, venture companies in the early 2000s from a technology standpoint, where some of these cryptocurrencies may grow to be, 10x, 100x, and we are giving, hopefully at Bitstamp, the ability for retail investors to participate safely in a regulated environment, in that ecosystem where, a lot of times they can't participate because a lot of those companies that are public are not necessarily public yet, or they don't have access to those IPOs in the public markets necessarily, or seed investments in the private markets. So I do think, in terms of cryptocurrencies, there's a lot of ones out there that are really interesting. We're hopeful to expand that access to people.
So I'm curious, do regulators look at cryptocurrency in Europe and around the world differently from they do here in the US?
I think they do. And it is interesting sitting at Bitstamp, where we try and operate in every jurisdiction in a regulated manner, which is different than some of our competitors. But ultimately, I think in a lot of ways, the US continues to lead on the regulatory front just because of our tradition around securities laws. I think what you've seen out of the CFTC and SEC has been really positive, as there's been some clarification there around what is and what isn't a security. In Europe, I think, we are engaging, and where things differ in Europe is, every country in Europe is starting to figure out how they want to regulate crypto. The UK through the FCA is looking at things a little bit different than Germany and the Netherlands, which are looking and more focused on KYC, AML, and how do you make sure there's anti-money laundering protections in place. So I do think there are some differences there, and it is interesting, but we're trying to engage with every regulator, as kind of the landscape continues to be defined.
Yeah. I think earlier we were also talking about the popularity of Bitcoin, particularly here in the US, thanks to some evangelists like Elon Musk and Kathy Woods, and I'm sure they play a role, right?
They definitely play a role, and Kathy being one of the fund managers has had unbelievable performance, and she added Bitcoin to our portfolio in the very early days before it really was thought of as a potential institutional asset class. I think has done a great service to the asset class and to the industry as a whole, because at the end of the day, a lot of institutional investors in Wall Street, in particular, looks at performance, and that drives a lot of investments. And so Kathy and ARK's performance has been phenomenal. And folks like Elon, from the technology side and a corporate treasury perspective, has laid out a groundwork for a lot of other companies to follow. And I think continues to do a lot of interesting things around, making it so you can buy a Tesla with Bitcoin. And I think that was a lot of the pushback for a long time. Well, I'll buy Bitcoin, but I can't use it as a payment. You're starting to see that change a little bit. And so I think, both Kathy and Tesla, Michael Saylor, some of these other investors at the institutional level are really driving the asset class forward every day, which is great to see.
So let me bring this back full circle a little bit and get your thoughts on what you think will have the biggest impact on Bitcoin prices this year.
I think the continued institutional adoption, if an ETF does get approved at the end of the day, I think looking at more regulatory clarity, I think in general would really help the industry continue to grow. We have conversations, every day with institutional investors who, don't know how to even do accounting around Bitcoin, let alone, do you need to be a broker dealer? Do you need to be an ATS from some of the regulatory perspectives? So I think, regulatory clarity, an ETF approval, and then that infrastructure build. We are seeing it every day at Bitstamp. VC money is coming into the space. New and interesting companies are coming into the space to help solve some of the collateral issues, some of the smart order routers, prime brokerage, custody. And I do think as some of those solutions come online, you're going to be able to see more and more folks get involved in the space and more money come into the space more efficiently. So I think those are all going to be catalysts at the end of the day.